Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, April 15th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, a former law enforcement official brings a case-building mindset to his new role as Inspector General at the Department of Labor. Plus, a new GAO report finds most of the Pentagon's joint bases are falling short of facility sustainment goals. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. When the Office of Management and Budget decided to remove the specific section on enterprise risk management from Circular A-123, Eric Uland, the Deputy Director for Management, received some direct feedback.
Now, feedback among those who practice ERM has ranged from broad-based and serious disappointment, some anger, and a few responses summed up without expletives as, "Are you out of your bleeping mind?"
For more on why Uland says the ERM community's unhappiness with the OMB decision is overblown, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller joins me now with details. Jason, great to have you.
Thanks, Terry.
Tell us more about why Mr. Uland believes concerns about removing enterprise risk management as a section from Circular 123 are overstated.
Terry, this goes back to almost 10 months ago. We got an early copy of the revision of A123, and I wrote a story about it and got tons of questions, and people were really like, okay, what's going on? What have you heard? Lots of questions. So when OMB released that final update just March 10th of A123, obviously folks were disappointed. And maybe a few were surprised as well that when they removed the entire section that highlighted enterprise risk management as a requirement, that came to fore. Now, speaking at the Association for Enterprise Risk Management Summit last week, Uland addressed what he called the elephant in the room right away.
Enterprise risk management sitting in an OMB circular was, in the end, its very own risk. Why do I say that? Reducing risk management to a management directive became the gateway to a simple federal government compliance exercise, rather than an actual federal government doing exercise. Enterprise risk management was always part of federal leadership and execution, but turning it into a series of reports and responsibilities made it too theoretical and drove it away from the practical. It became a spreadsheet and a do-out, rather than a learned and practiced skill.
Uland offered a personal example from when he worked at the State Department during President Donald Trump's first term. He says he went to that initial meeting of the Enterprise Risk Management Council where they talked about, again, this theoretical risk challenges, but he believes they ignored the practical steps to lower risk. He says those council meetings really never changed over time or evolved. The members had the same conversations over and over again. He says having ERM in its own section in the circular leads to a trap of compliance instead of action.
What does this update to the circular, the removal of the prescriptive ERM framework, really mean? Let me be clear and level set. It does not mean that managing risk for the enterprise is no longer important, nor does it mean that the tools and skills to manage enterprise risk are no longer needed. What it does mean is that now leaders have the opportunity to conduct risk management without the restrictions of burdensome process. Now they have the opportunity to customize how they implement an enterprise risk system that works with their approach to managing their organization and aligned to its culture. Risk management is no longer the responsibility of a single council or a single position. It's no longer someone else's responsibility because it isn't in my job title, something I've heard said more than once. Risk management is now the responsibility of every council, of every position. It should be ingrained into every agency's culture and integrated into every decision at every level.
Jason, that seems to leave open the window of what exactly agencies should do to implement ERM if it's not going to be explicitly written into 123.
Well, first of all, it says you heard Uland say ERM is not going away. The administration still believes in its concepts, its use, its ideas. But he says risk management is about understanding risk, of course, aligning what's necessary to reduce risk with an enterprise strategy, and managing that risk in a way that strengthens decision-making and drives mission success. Uland says leaders must champion risk management as a strategic tool, not as a bureaucratic requirement done well.
Done well, it is embedded into planning cycles, budget formulation, and data-driven performance reviews. And it must be supported by reliable data, clear governance structures, and continuous learning. Risk management is not about eliminating risk. It is about managing it intelligently. It enables organizations to navigate uncertainty, seize opportunities, and achieve objectives with greater confidence and higher effectiveness. Integrating risk management with internal management routines for driving results and organizational performance is essential to building a modern, high-performing.
Now, Uland says ERM also remains a key piece of the budget process under Circular A11. So again, OMB is not abandoning this concept in any way. Another concern that Uland highlighted was about splitting ERM out as its own section in A123 was that these concepts, enterprise risk management concepts, were seen as a separate thing to do, not, as you heard him just say, an integrated concept that OMB believes it really should be.
Our role as leaders in government is to see problems early, understand their implications and trade-offs, find ways to navigate and mitigate this uncertainty's impact to mission delivery, and succeed. That isn't a secondary function. It's central to mission success. When it comes to risk management as a leader, it's a strategic advice multiplier. It enables decisions. It guides execution. Done well, it improves decision-making, reduces surprises, enhances performance, and delivers results. In the end, everyone empowered as an enterprise risk manager means an enterprise less at risk every single day.
Jason, there was a lot of celebrating when ERM got added into 123. What's the reaction now that it's being taken out?
I think there's a lot of disappointment, a lot of concerns. You know, as you mentioned, ERM first appeared in A123 in 2016 because of some of the exact reasons Uland was highlighting. The need to integrate risks across multiple mission areas, whether it's back office operations like HR and cybersecurity, or across mission areas that now share data and rely on one another to find success. Tom Brandt is a former chief risk officer at the IRS and the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. He's now retired. He says it seems like Uland had a bad experience at state, and that's clouding his view of enterprise risk management. Brent says over the last 18 years of Affirm summits, they've heard dozens of examples of agencies that successfully implemented ERM, not just as a set of spreadsheets and meetings, but as a value-added method for getting to critical insights, so leaders can help improve agency performance, and by fostering a culture of transparency, that enabled, to his point, of information flowing down to all levels, getting ahead of those risks, and then impacting that mission outcome. Terry also spoke with Ann Eberts. She's the CEO of AGA. She says by removing ERM as a section of A123, she feels like that's taken a big step backwards. She says ERM breaks down silos across agencies. It gives executives working on specific programs really a good reason to talk to each other, where maybe they wouldn't if they were just kind of in their own little, to her point, silos. Eberts says by creating a risk registry as an example, and then sharing that and discussing it across the agency, that ensures managers and employees see real or potential impacts more broadly, and then they can work together to resolve it because few risks are solely impacting a single program or a single office.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for joining me. It sounds like this pendulum is going to continue to swing.
Absolutely, Terry. Always my pleasure.
You can find Jason's full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, a law enforcement background shapes how the new Inspector General at the Department of Labor approaches oversight. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. From unemployment insurance to workforce programs, the stakes for fraud oversight at the U.S. Department of Labor remain high. The department's Inspector General says his law enforcement experience influences how he prioritizes cases and assesses risk. Anthony Desposito, the DOLIG, joins me now to discuss his approach to this important work. Mr. Desposito, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
You have had one of the more interesting career paths to your current position. You spent over 15 years as a detective in the New York Police Department. You were a town councilman. You were an elected member of the House of Representatives. How on earth did you find your way back to the executive branch as an IG, no less?
Well, I think that, to be honest, serving as an inspector general, I think that there is a lot of benefits to someone, especially now, and the war that we have on fraud. Not saying that it wasn't always there, but I think that the renewed commitment to the war on fraud and the fact that the administration is pressing prosecutors throughout the country in order to begin to prosecute types of fraud, regardless of how much or how little it is. I think that it's critically important that these IG's offices have a career or decorated law enforcement professionals, people who have been on the streets, who have conducted investigations, who have hunted criminals, who have sat across the interview table from, whether it was gang members or people who have murdered individuals or people who have committed fraud. I think that having the ability to talk to people, to oversee investigations, to speak to your investigators throughout the nation and hear what they're doing, what their interview processes are, what their routines are when it comes to surveilling individuals and how these investigations start. I think having someone with the ability to look at it from a law enforcement lens is really important. And I think that at least from what I've heard and what I've seen, our investigators, our agents throughout the nation are pretty excited that they have someone who is now leading the agency, who has put the uniform on, who has been in the locker room and geared up and not only been a street cop, but taken hundreds of illegal firearms off the street, dismantled gangs, was a highly decorated detective, and someone who knows how to put cases together and present them to prosecutors for the best possible outcome. So I think that our investigators are excited, and they are. I'm looking to learn from the things that they've done, and I know that they're certainly looking to, find out from me what it is that I could bring to them, not just in personal knowledge, but in resources, in education, in training, in equipment that they need in order to move forward. And when it comes to the government political side of it, I was a councilman in the town of Hempstead, and for those not familiar with the town of Hempstead is actually the largest town in the United States of America. We're bigger than 7 or 8 states by population, a budget of about $600 million, 3,500 full-time employees. So, serving as deputy supervisor of America's largest town and operating a budget that large and being responsible for full-time employees, I think that it really gives you an opportunity to understand and to see how sometimes difficult it is to lead a group of that large. And I think that that's going to be extra beneficial in leading this agency. And then obviously serving as a member of the House of Representatives, we all know that getting things done not just is about commitment and hard work, but it's about relationships. And I think that as someone who served in the House of Representatives, a conservative Republican from New York who was pro-labor, was voted, I think, the 10th or 11th most bipartisan member of the House of Representatives. I was a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a caucus with equal amount of Democrats and Republicans who try to work hard to find solutions to problems facing this nation. I think that highlights my relationships on both sides of the aisle. So I think that when it comes to, again, getting things done, when it comes to raising awareness, when it comes to bringing resources back to this agency, having those relationships, not just in the House, but with the Senate side and obviously the administration is important.
Well, you stepped into your role as the IG at the Department of Labor back in January. As you've been getting oriented, what has stood out to you the most about the scope of DOL's programs and the oversight responsibilities attached to them?
Yeah, it's tremendous. And I think that one of the things that that probably surprised me the most was the expansive portfolio of many of our agents and our auditors and our civilians. I mean, the work that this team does each and every day should really be applauded. I mean, they, the battle of fraud and the war on fraud has taken headlines recently, and I'm proud of that. But I think that these individuals here have been trying to tackle and been front lines on the war on fraud for a long time. I think the difference now is we have, like was mentioned just a couple of minutes ago. Right now, we have prosecutors and we have a commitment from the administration that they want to move these cases forward. Starting to visit all of the regional offices throughout the nation, I hear frequently from the agents who said, we worked 6, 7, 8 months, over a year on an investigation, and we presented it to a prosecutor who said that, $2 million in fraud doesn't really meet the threshold that we need. Well, the way I look at it is, $2 million is a lot of money. And if you, as Ronald Reagan said, $1 million here, $1 million there, and before you know it, you're talking about real money. And I think that that's what we're dealing with now. So to have an administration, and I was recently named to the president's fraud task force, to have an administration that's committed to fraud and rooting out fraud and has made it clear that they will make every resource available to help do that, and obviously use their influence to make sure that the prosecutors know that these are cases that we want to move forward. So I think, going back to the original question, what has surprised me is really the scope and the broad scope that these agents and auditors have. I mean, there's so much work that can be done. And I think that also one of the things that the agents and auditors are happy to hear is when I'm visiting these regional offices and they say, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've presented a case about, human trafficking or sex trafficking. And we were told that that's not really our role. How do you feel about that? And the way I look at it is we're law enforcement professionals and we should be hunting down criminals however and wherever we can. So I'm looking forward to not only embracing the expansive scope that the Department of Labor has, but expanding that scope, obviously still meeting our mission and fitting our mission, but to give our agents and auditors sort of a bigger threshold for them to find and tackle and facilitate cases that they are interested in working.
You've mentioned the fraud issue a couple of times so far, and recent DOL IG work has highlighted ongoing risks around unemployment insurance fraud. You mentioned child labor enforcement challenges, grant oversight. Where have you asked your team of auditors to focus first?
So I think that, with the statute of limitations on some of the pandemic fraud kind of withering away each and every day, I've tried to use my relationships recently. Obviously, there's a piece of legislation that came out of the Ways and Means Committee that has extended the statute of limitations for pandemic era fraud. We're hoping that it will make its way to the floor of the Senate. It's something that I mentioned both at the first fraud task force meeting, and we had a follow-up phone call just this Thursday, and I've mentioned it both times of how important it is. So I think that, right now, just because of the timing, one of the things that we are still focused on is that pandemic era fraud. Recently, we put out a financial memo where our auditors have identified close to $1 billion with a B, still sitting on prepaid debit cards that was issued during the pandemic. So right now we're focused on trying to find a way both to extend the statute of limitations so we can continue to prosecute these cases, and then B, find a way to work with the Treasury to claw this money back and get it back into the hands of the American people. So, and then, obviously there's the fraud that's been focused so much on TV, which is the medical Medicaid, but still a lot of that kind of reaches back right into the pandemic era fraud. We were in California on Wednesday and Thursday announcing a takedown with the U.S. attorney there and Dr. Oz, shutting down over 200 hospices, all with ties leading back to some sort of labor investigation, whether they were utilizing money that was spent by labor unions or other investigative processes that led us to these hospices. We're working with our federal and local partners to shut them down and to hold, to put people in handcuffs and hold them accountable.
I'm speaking with Anthony Desposito. He's the Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Labor. Mr. Desposito, the Trump administration has plans to transfer billions of dollars of grant programs from the Department of Education to the Department of Labor. As you're thinking about that, what is your office doing to help build the anti-fraud governance and control mechanisms on the front end so that hopefully the investigations are fewer on the back end?
Yeah, it was one of the reasons as to why I fully embraced and was proud to be named to the fraud task force. The president and his team and the vice president have recently nominated and was Senate confirmed Colin McDonald, who's going to be sort of the fraud czar and focus in the U.S. attorney. He's going to be the U.S. attorney in charge of fraud. And within a couple of hours of being confirmed, he sent a memo out that he is establishing a federal fraud database. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all of our caseload, whether it's suspects, whether it's perpetrators, whether it's social security numbers and information that we've gathered that we think is linked to fraud. And we are going to start entering it into one central location so that the information that now comes over from the Department of Education or any other department, that it's in a central location that can be utilized to, make sure that this fraud doesn't continue. And again, we stop it right where it is right now. And two, grow this partnership so that we're not being duplicative in the investigative and audit work that we're doing. There's no reason for the Department of Labor to be conducting an audit that's extremely similar to an audit that's being done in the Department of Education. Having this central workplace and being able to share intelligence and information will not only make our job more efficient, but it will make sure that we can place resources where they need to be, move personnel into different places so that they could be as effective as possible. So I think that making sure that the sharing of information is continuous is really important. I think that it's while so many law enforcement agencies work together every single day, I will say as someone who came from the NYPD, many law enforcement professionals hold their intelligence pretty close to the vest, right? Because you want to make sure that you keep it tight, that you keep the information, to your team so that you can do the best work that you can. But in a case like this, where so much of fraud investigation has to do with raw data, I think that sharing that raw data is important and will only benefit the prosecution of fraudsters in the future.
How do you balance this intense focus on fraud detection and prevention with the other side of the IG coin, which is program evaluation, program delivery, and effectiveness? How do you keep those two in balance?
I think that they're able to work parallel. I think that our auditors are focused each and every day on making sure that the programs that are available to the American people are running efficiently and are supporting the efforts that they were put in place for. And when those programs are no longer doing the intent that they were developed for, I think then that's when we step in and try to find or suggest alternative measures. And I think that having a collaboration and making sure that the civilians and the auditors and the investigators are working really in tandem and at a parallel is what's important. And it's one thing that I firmly believe that we will be most effective. We will find the best prosecution possibilities and we will be most successful if our team works together. And it's one of the reasons as to why I've worked with my new deputy, Mike Dillinger, who is also a career law enforcement individual in sort of, reprogramming and reimagining this IG's office. I think that there's a reorganization in place, not just because we want to move people into different places, but because we really, coming from decades in government and politics and having a career in law enforcement and him having a career in law enforcement and working in other IG's offices, we know what works and we know what doesn't work. And I think that while many of the things may have worked here in the past, one of the terms that I think drives me the most insane is we've always done it this way. And that doesn't always mean that it's the right way to do it. So I think that our reorganization of this IG's office is going to play a critical role in really building and molding the agency into one of the most effective inspectors general offices that this federal government has. I mean, I'm sitting in my office and I have a complete, flow chart of every member of our team across the nation and here in DC. And it is something that each day we look at, we find out who would be more helpful somewhere else. Who do we think personally would shine better in a different position? So I think that work is ongoing. And I think that balance is important.
And as you're pursuing that agency reorganization, how are you and your deputy then establishing expectations for the office while still making sure that you maintain that objective independence that is so important for the IG's work?
Yeah, so we recently put out a message to all of our staff, politicals, careers, auditors, civilians, agents. We put a survey out, and it was pretty simple. We want to know what's working. We want to know what's not working. We want to know what you thought was successful with the last IG and his team, and what do you think could change? And I think that, first of all, giving the entire team the ability to anonymously tell you what it is they think is working and not working, has provided real insight into the work that we're doing. I think that a lot of the changes that we've already made has been embraced by the team, and they're happy to see that there's changes being made there. I know that not just visiting sites throughout the country and hearing, wow, it's great to have our IG here. I make it I do my best to, when there are press conferences that are announced for the great work that's being done, across the country, I've really done my best to anyone that I'm invited to. I get on that next plane and go out there, not because it's an opportunity for me to get in front of a camera, but it's an opportunity for me to tell the story of the great work that our agents are doing throughout this nation. And I think that having, the leader of the agency there rooting them on means a lot. It's one thing to, send an email and say great work. It's another thing to shake that person's hand and say, job well done. So that's something that we are trying to do. And I think when you talk about taking the input and the insight from people that have been here, whether they've been here for 40 years or whether they've been here for 4 days, all of that information matters. And I think that, for me, remaining independent is pretty simple. I can be a conservative Republican. I can be someone who was nominated by President Trump. I can be someone who served as a Republican member of Congress. And I can obviously have my opinions, but I also served as a New York City detective in probably one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the United States of America. And I worked always in a team atmosphere. And every day when I got out of the car, take an illegal gun or place a murder suspect in handcuffs, I did it with individuals of different color skin, of different economic background, of different religions, and certainly different political ideologies. But their life depended on me, and my life depended on them. And that's the same thing I bring to this office, is that, you never respond to a 911 call and first ask the person, what political party are they from? And the way that I look at it is many of the things that the administration believes in, this war on fraud, while yes, it's coming from a Republican president and a Republican vice president, and yes, the Republicans control the House and the Senate, I think that the war on fraud is not a Republican or a Democrat issue. It's an American issue. And quite frankly, we should all be rooting out fraud, and we should be doing our best to make life more affordable. And I say it often because I believe it. I think that fraud is a tax on the American people, and we should be working to eliminate it.
I've been speaking with Anthony D'Esposito. He's the Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Labor. Sir, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, GAO finds most of the Pentagon's joint bases are falling short of facility sustainment goals, raising new questions about readiness and accountability. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Defense Department's joint bases were created to improve efficiency and readiness, but sustaining those facilities has proven uneven. A new GAO report finds most joint bases are funded below sustainment goals, with limited visibility into how resources are allocated and lingering disputes over who pays for what. To walk through the findings and what they mean for readiness, we're joined by Alyssa Siz, Director of Defense Capabilities and Management at the Government Accountability Office. Ms. Siz, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to talk about joint military bases. Back in 2009 and 10, DoD consolidated 26 military installations into 12 joint bases. And the hypothesis was that this would increase readiness, reduce duplication, and save costs. GAO's got a new report out looking at this process and the program. What did you find? Do the actual results support the hypothesis?
Right. So DoD did consolidate 26 installations into 12 joint bases over a decade ago. Exactly right, to try to achieve efficiencies and cost savings. Our report shows that the joint bases have a number of challenges, particularly when it comes to funding facilities and installations on those joint bases.
The idea with a joint base was that one military service would be in charge and the rest would be supported, so a supported relationship. But you found that 11 of those 12 bases received less funding than DoD's facility sustainment goal over all of this time. What does that shortfall mean on the ground for base operations and mission support?
Yes, so DoD has a goal to fund at least 90% of its requirements for facility sustainment across its installations. We found at the 12 joint bases, the average funding level was about 57% across those 12 bases over a 5-year period. So that's significantly lower than DoD's funding goal. And unfortunately, as a result, we saw numerous instances where facilities were not kept up into good working order. So we saw deteriorating buildings, we saw HVAC systems that were not working, that were housing kind of sensitive weapons systems and other equipment that's very important for the mission of the services. We saw instances where buildings had to be abandoned and not used at all, leaking pipes. It sort of ran the course of many different challenges, due to lack of funding.
We have heard persistent stories about lack of maintenance in military barracks and military family housing. Is that captured in this set of underfunding?
Yes. And GAO has reported extensively on the barracks and on housing issues and underfunding those. Ironically, we point out in this report that, the Army, for instance, has devoted a lot of funding to kind of shore up its barracks, and that is taking away funds from other facilities on installations, too. So that was a challenge we found in this report. But absolutely, the same issue applies to housing.
So it's both living spaces and operational spaces that are suffering.
Yes.
But the next point you make is that DoD lacks reliable data on how facility funding is distributed between the supported services and the supporting services. Explain why, after all of this time, they still can't get a handle on who's funding how much on each installation.
Yes. So having good information is the first step to solve a problem. But unfortunately for the joint bases, DoD was not collecting data on how funds were distributed between sort of that lead service, who has responsibility for most of the sustainment of facilities, and the supporting services. They only had one large number that rolled up the entire base. So you really couldn't look at how much though each service was getting and whether one was being underfunded more significantly than the other on the base. So we did make a recommendation that DoD needs to collect this data so they first have good information about how money is being spent and allocated on the bases, and then can take some steps to address any issues. When we surveyed base commanders, and we did a survey of all 12 joint bases for this review, we surveyed command leadership, we consistently heard that the supported services felt like their needs were not being addressed and not recognized by the lead service. But DoD did not have the data to be able to see if that was the case or not.
I'm speaking with Alyssa Siz. She's Director of Defense Capabilities and Management at GAO. Well, the lack of data, I think, gets to the next point that you made in the report, which is ongoing cost-sharing disputes between the military services totaling billions of dollars. Is the structure on these joint bases such that it is like a tenant-landlord relationship, the supporting organization collects rents or fees from the organizations that are tenants, and that's still not clear?
So the lead service is generally responsible for the sustainment of facilities and infrastructure of the supporting services. But what we found was there's a lack of guidance on how that process bears out. Basically, it's supposed to start at the base level, and then if there's a dispute there, it kind of goes up the chain all the way up to the Office of Secretary of Defense. There's a lot of agreements that were out of date. The guidance was confusing. That process was very laborious and time sensitive, or time intensive, I should say. And as a result, there were numerous cost disputes, which we point out some examples in the report, where one service felt like their needs were not being addressed by the other service. We have an entire appendix in the report talking about a situation on Joint Base Hickam in Hawaii, where there was an airfield in really disrepair that the Air Force really needed for their mission. And there was sort of a patchwork going on for several years where they were patching asphalt onto this airfield. Gravel was kind of flying up into the fighter jets that were crossing that. It was a very serious situation, but the Navy disputed whether they needed to fund that or not. This went all the way up outside of the process to the Secretary of the Navy and Air Force, who finally had to step in and get a resolution to that issue. And that's one example, but there are several cost disputes, kind of not understanding the process there.
You've given us a really significant operational impact from those disputes. How is the resolution process supposed to work? Is there an operational governance mechanism inside DoD?
Yes. So I had mentioned that the process was very confusing. There were a lot of different guidance documents governing that. During the course of our review, DoD did put out new guidance last summer that does clarify roles and responsibilities. And we point that out in the report. We do think that that's a good step, that may move things in the right direction to get a better understanding of what the process should be. We were actually going to make a recommendation on that, but DoD proactively put out that guidance. So we do think that that has benefits, that could resolve some of the issues that we pointed out.
So beyond the funding and governance issues that we've just talked through, the report also indicates that there are pretty significant workforce shortages amongst the personnel who are responsible for managing these joint base facilities. How do those staffing gaps then compound the risks of deferred maintenance and facility degradation?
Yeah, it's another significant factor. So we found significant workforce shortages, but really the problem was that none of the military services had reassessed their workforce requirements for their maintenance workforce since joint bases were established. So many years had passed, missions were increasing on several of these bases, but they didn't really understand what their maintenance workforce needs were. So it was hard to kind of target actions to increase those workforces when they didn't really know what the requirements were.
Is this a function that could be contracted out so that as we've watched the Department of Defense go through some pretty significant workforce reductions over the last year, perhaps they don't intend to replace these folks? Maybe they intend to do it via contract?
Yeah, there are different models, and some of them do use contractors. That's not without their challenges as well, too. Sometimes it takes longer to get contractors in for emergent requirements, too. So that using a contractor workforce is an option that some of the services do use, but they need to think strategically about that and really understand what their workforce needs are, regardless of who's going to perform that work.
When you look at this whole issue, funding, governance, staffing, guidance, GAO's made a number of recommendations here. Walk us through those and what's really at the top of the list. Which one, if they could take care of it, would make a big difference?
Sure. So we had 5 recommendations in this report. The first one, and I would say the most important one, is that DoD really needs to assess the risks of underfunding its facility sustainment. So as I mentioned, they were only funding to about 57% of their requirement. That has had real impacts on missions and operations on these bases. But they don't understand, right? We hear a lot of talk about DoD willing to accept risk, but really understanding what those risks are and doing that analysis is very important. So we had a recommendation on that. The other recommendations go toward the issues we've been talking about, getting better information on how funding is allocated among the various services on joint bases. So not having that basic information on how you're spending the money for sustainment is a real problem for DoD. So getting better visibility over funding so they can take actions. And then the last three recommendations go to the military departments to assess their workforce requirements for maintenance on their installations.
I've been speaking with Alyssa Sizz. She's Director of Defense Capabilities and Management at GAO. Ms. Sizz, I really appreciate you joining us and walking us through this important report.
Thank you very much.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. House Democrats are doubling down on their investigation into the Trump administration's management of the government's retirement processing system. That comes as some federal retirees remain without annuities months after submitting their applications. Here with the latest is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
Let's start with some context. What has been going on with the retirement processing for the last several months?
We've seen a major surge in retirement applications from federal employees over the last several months or even longer potentially. And this really comes down to the Trump administration's broad efforts to reduce the size of the federal workforce. As an offshoot of that, a lot of federal employees have submitted retirement paperwork if they decided to take, for example, the deferred resignation program and they were eligible for retirement, they could then retire through that program and take advantage of it in that way. So as a result, we've seen a major increase, almost unprecedented surge of applications enter agencies, HR offices, payroll providers, and then the Office of Personnel Management as that final step of that retirement processing. But because of that significant increase in retirement volume, we've seen a lot of delays from federal retirees who are trying to get their applications processed, trying to get their annuity payments started. A lot of this comes back to agencies and payroll providers, but also OPM as those steps, get underway for retirement processing. And because of those delays, of course, we've heard a lot of frustrations from retirees as well, who have gone sometimes, in some cases, for months without any payments at all.
The House Democrats sent a letter to OPM this week. What are they looking for information on?
They're looking more deeply into OPM's retirement processing systems and how they're managing what's been a major surge in retirement application volumes. So, for example, they're questioning how OPM is making sure that retirees who no longer have access to their government emails or systems can still stay in touch with their agencies and get updates on the progress of their application processing. They're also looking for more information on OPM's new online retirement application, or ORA. This is something that OPM launched last summer to digitize the federal retirement process. And then they're also the lawmakers are looking into some staffing losses at OPM as well. As we know, the agency lost about a third of its total workforce, or about 1,000 employees during the course of 2025. That included more than 100 employees in the Retirement Services Office specifically. None of those were forced terminations or anything like that, but the staffing decrease did potentially create concerns from the Inspector General Office at OPM about how retirement services would continue processing all the paperwork and continue managing the customer service center and phone lines as retirees are asking more and more questions about the status of their applications.
This investigation in Congress actually started back in December. You've talked about a lot of issues here. Was there something that kicked it off specifically?
Well, there was just a lot of reporting, including Federal News Network's own reporting, talking about the unprecedented surge of retirement applications. I'm sure the lawmakers also heard from a lot of their constituents about frustrations and concerns with getting their applications processed. So they wrote an initial letter that these House Democrats to OPM Director Scott Cooper back in December to just understand the situation better and also question, how the Trump administration's workforce reductions have really had this outsized impact on retirement processing. OPM did respond to that initial request, but the lawmakers now with the second letter seem not completely satisfied. They said that there were gaps in Director Cooper's answers and they wanted more information on the situation.
What has OPM been doing to try to address this retirement surge?
Well, one was, as I mentioned, the online retirement application, which they launched last summer. That was a major improvement in OPM's ability to process applications. They say it reduces the amount of time it takes to process a retirement claim in half. And it's an attempt to modernize and streamline the government's retirement system, which for many, many years has been paper-based, has been very slow and cumbersome. So there are a lot of benefits to that ORA system. But at the same time, it's coming as there's a major surge in the applications too. So there are some questions remaining there. But other than the ORA, OPM is also trying to give at least interim annuities to retirees, which is essentially a portion of what their final annuity will be that they can get temporarily while OPM continues to process their applications. The only issue with that is that you can only get your interim annuity once your application hits OPM's step of the process. If your application is stuck with your home agency or with a payroll provider, then you're kind of out of luck and you're not going to be getting an annuity until those steps are complete and your application is at OPM. So long story short, OPM is trying to address this issue. They've been very transparent that, yes, there is absolutely a large surge of applications. There are still questions coming from the lawmakers at the same time here.
Drew, do we have good data about where all of the claims are in the cycle?
What we do get good data on is the amount of claims that are at OPM and being processed in that final step of the retirement process. As of March this year, there were about 55,000 retirement applications that were still not finalized, but being processed at OPM. That is significantly above where OPM's retirement claim inventory has been historically. But it is at least a little bit lower than it was earlier this year. If you look back to February, OPM had even more applications, 65,000 rather than the 55,000 they have now. So that's just a sign that they are potentially increasing the speed in which they're able to process applications, as well as just being able to process more applications by using the ORA system, that digital online retirement processing system. But there's still a lot of applications entering OPM system too, coming from payroll providers and agencies. We saw about nearly 15,000 retirement applications enter that step of the process just last month. So we've seen these numbers consistently for months and months on end. A lot of applications just continuing to flood OPM. And of course, on the other end of that pipeline, you're seeing retirees who are frustrated with the delays and not getting their payments just yet.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for keeping us up to date on this important story.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Terry.
You can find all the details in her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.